The history of humanity can be viewed through a great many theoretical structures, or frameworks, that define and explain simple progression and regression, as well as more complex cultural shifts and upheavals. For example, viewing the history of humanity through an economic lens, one could explain the shifts and upheavals through the various stages of economic development, and the replacement of older economic systems with new economic systems. The focus would be on the changes in economic classes, the distribution of labor, the distribution of resources, and the conflict between competing economic systems in the same time period. Viewing the history of humanity through an ethical lens, one would define the shifts and upheavals through changing social values, sweeping philosophical transformations, adherence to and abandonment of different normative ethical systems, the varying popularity of which can be traced throughout time. The focus here would be on the rise, fall, replacement, and refinement of social values over both time and how these values differ in disparate societies and nations within the same time period. Viewing the history of humanity through a religious lens, one would define the shifts and upheavals similarly to an ethical lens. New beliefs, new religions, comparative religions in disparate societies and nations, but with the addition of waxing and waning secularism. These theoretical structures or frameworks are neither mutually exclusive nor directly competing, particularly when one considers the inevitable overlap. Instead, these frameworks can be helpful for the sake of narrowing focus and therefore convenience, not to mention helping in providing solutions. For instance, an economic solution first requires an economic framework for the problem. These frameworks are not attempts to find a universal solution to why things are the way they are. Another framework for viewing the history of humanity is through the conflict between egalitarian politics and hierarchical politics. The left and right, respectively. Egalitarian politics endorse a society in which people are treated equally, receive equal rights, and equal protection. Hierarchical politics endorse the opposite, a society made up of hierarchies of people. Hierarchies exist within economic systems, class divide. An economic system with tremendous economic disparity between the classes, with little to no support for the lower economic class, would be considered more hierarchical or right-wing than an economic system approaching something resembling equality of distribution. Hierarchies also exist within governmental systems, the levels of state power and the limits of the authority of the people. A governmental system that concentrates authority among the few would be considered more hierarchical or right-wing than a governmental system in which greater authority is given to the many. These hierarchies exist because of and are maintained by the self-interest of those in higher positions in said hierarchies. Social hierarchies also exist, and they are similarly maintained through self-interest. A hierarchy of racial supremacy is maintained by the racial majority, almost always the numerical majority, but in rare cases due to lingering colonialism, the numerical minority maintains a controlling economic interest and governmental authority, such as in South Africa. Similarly, a hierarchy of gender is not maintained through strict numerical majority, but through generational controlling interest. To the right, self-interested hierarchies are necessary for their vision of society. To some on the right, these hierarchies are also divinely ordained, the product of their god or gods, and consequently incontrovertibly true to themselves. Therefore, maintaining these hierarchies, this inequality, is an absolute good and cannot be contradicted without also contradicting their rigid, supernatural dogma. Social hierarchies are commonly promoted through the vague but powerful concept of traditionalism, a belief that can only justify itself through paradoxical self-justification. Social hierarchies can be enforced by law or by culture. As an example of the former, a law that forbids marriage equality enforces a hierarchy of heteronormativity. As an example of the latter, a culture that commits hate crimes against the gay community also enforces the hierarchy of heteronormativity. Sometimes the cultural aspect of a social hierarchy is so prevalent that legal protections are often unhelpful. Street harassment is generally illegal, but it is so common and so easy to escape consequences that women who are sexually harassed walking down the sidewalk do not often receive justice. This forces women to live with consistent sexual harassment. This harassment culturally enforces the hierarchy of patriarchy. Throughout the course of human history, various emancipatory movements and reactionary movements have provided greater egalitarianism and hierarchism respectively. An emancipatory movement is an effort or campaign to secure social rights, political rights, economic rights, or equality for a specific group of people within a society, or for that society more generally. An emancipatory movement aims to remove or reduce a hierarchy of people. A reactionary movement is an effort or campaign to reverse the results of an emancipatory movement and return society to its previous status quo, a return to its previous hierarchy. As one example, the abolitionist cause in the United States in the 19th century was an emancipatory movement. Following the end of the Civil War, the constitutional amendment that abolished slavery, except in cases of prisoners, was ratified on December 6, 1865, and was proclaimed on December 18th. Less than 1 week later, on December 24th, 6 Confederate veterans created the Ku Klux Klan as part of a reactionary movement, an attempt to re-establish the racial hierarchy, to reassert white supremacy. Reactionary movements can spring from violent groups, but they can also spring from politicians. The recent reactionary movement against critical race theory perpetuates the white supremacist conspiracy theory that white people are under attack. This reactionary movement was popularized by mainstream politicians, not just white supremacist hate groups, but was celebrated by both. Although any political ideology can urge a return to a previous policy if the current policy is inadequate, emancipation is a specific tradition in left-wing politics, and reactionism is a specific tradition in right-wing politics. Labeling egalitarianism and emancipation as the left and hierarchism and reactionism as the right dates back only as far as 1789 during the French Revolution, a reference to the physical positions in the National Assembly. Nevertheless, the political positions of egalitarianism and hierarchism have arguably always existed. We just have those useful designations for them now, left and right. The linear classification is admittedly unavoidably reductive, but it is nonetheless helpful in explaining political ideals and political goals. Oppositional political rhetoric often purposefully confuses the makeup of this political divide. For example, in the United States and some other Western nations, those on the right sometimes wish to give the impression that the left is when the government does stuff, and that the more stuff the government does, the more left it is. This is not only reductive, but untrue. Some on the left wish to use the government to make more of our utilities and programs that ensure greater equality, publicly owned instead of privately owned by corporations. This is, at least in theory, in service of greater equality, not the vague concept of the government doing stuff. However, this is not even universal. Many on the left directly oppose the very existence of the state, and consequently wish to provide for the people through a society that, from the ground up, is without want, without need, without poverty, a society without hierarchy. Furthermore, leftists of differing stripes generally agree in their opposition to violent authority, such as state violence conducted by the police and imperialism conducted by the military. The common denominator on the left is egalitarianism, not the government. Similarly, liberals, who occupy a comparatively centrist position between the left and right, sometimes label the right as anti-government. This designation is, at best, a half-truth. The right wishes to reduce economic regulations, reduce funding to social programs, increase funding to the police, and increase funding to the military. These superficial contradictions in pro-government and anti-government policies make sense when one understands the right as favoring hierarchy instead of favoring government or lack of government. Reducing economic regulations allows for even greater control for capitalists, an economic hierarchy. Reducing funding to social programs is a way for the right to thumb its nose at egalitarianism, maintain the economic hierarchy, and maintain social hierarchies. Increasing funding to the police and military strengthens hierarchical control of society and global hegemony. Ronald Reagan famously claimed that the government is not the solution to the problem, government is the problem, but he was not referring to the police or the military. Reagan was not an anarchist, He was a strikebreaker and a friend to big business. The problem for him was actually anything that got in the way of capitalism or his hierarchical view of society. In short, when you think the left, think equality and emancipation. When you think the right, think hierarchy and reaction. The most common social hierarchies enforced in the so-called Western world are patriarchy, heteronormativity, cisnormativity, white supremacy, and Christian supremacy, or Christian nationalism. Patriarchy is a social system in which men are permitted dominance over other genders, historically, dominance over women. Under this system, men are granted either institutionalized privileges or cultural privileges that are not granted to other genders. The recent reactionary movement has scored victories against the autonomy of women and has reinserted notions once thought antiquated back into modern mainstream politics, such as access to birth control. White supremacy is a social system in which white people are given de facto and sometimes de jure elevated status in a white majority nation. White supremacy is not simply the domain of out and proud white supremacist hate groups. There is white supremacy as a belief, and there is white supremacy as a racial hierarchy which privileges white people over others regardless of the presence or absence of individual racial animosity or hatred. Heteronormativity is a social system in which heterosexuality is granted status as the normal sexuality, with heterosexual people given the privileges of invisibility and ubiquity. This sexual hierarchy moralizes sexual activity as normal and abnormal, creating the notion that heterosexuality's normality makes it safe to discuss, safe around children, and safe in popular media, whereas homosexuality, bisexuality, pansexuality, and anything that is not straight sexuality is somehow less safe to discuss, less safe around children, and less safe in popular media. Cisnormativity is a social system in which those who are cisgender are granted status as normal and given the aforementioned privileges of invisibility and ubiquity. Both heteronormativity and cisnormativity force LGBT people to consistently prove that they are safe to be around cisgender heterosexual people, safe to be around children, safe to be in popular media, safe even in bathrooms, even though there is actually no reason to believe LGBT people are less safe than cisgender heterosexual people. For traditionalists, it's not about being dangerous to others. It's about being dangerous to their vision of society, and that vision must be forced upon others. These various social hierarchies force marginalized people into being on guard at all times, which creates a minority stress common among marginalized people. Patriarchy is more than sexism. Heteronormativity is more than homophobia. Cisnormativity is more than transphobia. White supremacy is more than racism. These words are commonly used interchangeably, but sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and racism are often words used to describe individual failings and personal bigotries. Patriarchy, heteronormativity, cisnormativity, and white supremacy are widely held beliefs and systems. They are the hierarchies themselves, not the byproducts of these hierarchies. The right prefers to avoid references to these hierarchies, especially the names for these hierarchies.
If you were to assemble a list, a hierarchy of concerns, of problems this country faces, where would white supremacy be on the list? Right up there with Russia, probably. It's actually not a real problem in America.
Instead, the right avoids the terms and uses their umbrella term, traditionalism, thus avoiding any negative connotations associated with their goals. For example, the right wants to enforce patriarchy and simultaneously pretend that patriarchy does not exist. In doing so, the right can both advance and maintain this hierarchy while casting the opposition to this hierarchy as delusional and the enemies of their long-established way of life. The right and the left both know that patriarchy exists. The right simply believes that what we call patriarchy is natural, God-given, and good. Something so ubiquitous that it is unseen and does not even require a name, let alone a critical examination of the practice. The study of patriarchy concludes that there is a vastly uneven distribution of power, an inequality that is unjustifiable, and that this inequality is no more natural than any other social hierarchy that people commonly understand as morally wrong. The right's denial that patriarchy is wrong rejects the study that led to this conclusion altogether. As a consequence of this rejection, patriarchy holds a cognitive dissonance within right-wing politics. The content of patriarchy is both believed and desired, but both the name of patriarchy and the judgment of patriarchy as immoral are rejected. That's not patriarchy, the right says. That's just the way things are. A bizarre, empty fatalism held together by self-interest.
It's something bigger than that. What you're seeing is a coordinated attack on the family and on children.
The natural hierarchy justification is essentially that oppressive, coercive hierarchies occur accidentally, and that these hierarchies, oppressive or not, are overall beneficial for society. The supernatural hierarchy justification is that oppressive, coercive hierarchies are ordained by God and must be strenuously defended by human beings, lest God become angry. Unlike the naturalist justification, these hierarchies are admitted to be intentional, not accidental. Intentional by God and intentional by the defenders of God's hierarchies. These justifications are contradictory. Even if God created the natural world, his decrees are too intentional and inorganic. Nothing God does is by accident. Nevertheless, these justifications are often used in concert with one another. In both justifications, it's not truly the fault of human beings, and everyone gets what they deserve, a cognitive bias called the just world fallacy that is both self-serving and illogical. If hierarchies were calculable, measurable, and intentionally created by humans, hierarchies would then be changeable, and the right does not want that. A social hierarchy will always be resistant to change, reform, or abolition. First, the group that holds a high position in a hierarchy is not incentivized to give up their position. And second, this high position grants that group a power imbalance against the group that is incentivized to change, reform, or abolish the hierarchy. This power imbalance forces the group lower on the hierarchy to sometimes work outside the system because the system favors those at the top of the hierarchy. Then, this struggle outside the system is demonized and condemned by those who the system favors. It is not a condemnation born of principle. Instead, it is a condemnation born of self-interest. It is not a coincidence that those who believe in maintaining these hierarchies, more often than not, benefit most from the enforcement of these hierarchies. This is the reactionary movement of today, a right-wing counter-revolution against modern emancipatory victories and the modern world more generally. A pushback against hard-earned rights. A fearful, narrow-minded culture war dedicated to ending the threat of egalitarianism once and for all and replacing it with hierarchical, fascistic traditionalism. Coming soon, I will be creating a series of videos about the aforementioned social hierarchies and the resurgent reactionary movements of recent years and especially the past 12 months. White supremacist reactionism against critical race theory, heteronormative and cisnormative reactionism that aims to cast LGBT people as dangerous to children, and patriarchal reactionism against Roe v. Wade. This video contains the basics and serves as the introduction, whereas the next video will be far more expansive and focus on a specific social hierarchy. I hope that this will be a resource for both beginners and those already familiar with these hierarchies. Each video will utilize the emancipatory and hierarchical theoretical framework to explain how we got here, what we are doing now that we are here, and what we can do in the future to break free. Hi everybody. If you like what I do, make sure to subscribe to my channel and click the notification bell so that you never miss an episode. Also, check out my Patreon link. See you soon.